Welcome back to Picture Therapy. We are going to jump straight into unspoken family rules
Family rules, right.
rules. Maybe we can go unspoken later.
Well, we'll spend a lot of time on unspoken.
Yeah. Coming in from the last episode where we were talking about just the function of family systems and how they exist in not just families, but friend groups. Any system is essentially an ecosystem of relationships. And so
right.
Pulling from that, and presumably in every system, whether it's biological or familial or whatever, there are a bazillion different rules that they function by. So I'm just going to start there and see what happens.
Okay. Well, that's a great place to start. If we think about rules in general, every family has rules.
Sure.
And those rules help define who we are as a unit and what it is to be inside that unit, inside that system, or outside, who's inside, who's outside, etc. And we divide those rules, at least in family therapy, we divide those rules into two categories. And one is spoken, or what we call written rules. Okay, these were sometime in history said out loud.
So that's something like don't spit at the table, or
like
just
that.
Really overt rules.
Or what's bedtime?
Okay.
Or what are your chores?
Yeah.
Who takes out the garbage? Those kind of things.
Okay.
They were spoken at one time. Now, because they're spoken, they have a couple of characteristics. One, they're negotiable. I can say, "Hey, Dad, the lawn is bigger now. My allowance is XYZ. It takes more time. Can I get more allowance?" Now, the answer might be no, but the very fact that I'm saying that says this is okay. There isn't a stigma. We're allowed to talk about it, and I'm willing to take the risk for asking for more. So there's a lot that's embedded there. So one thing that they can be negotiated because they are identified. There's safety to it. And because they're spoken, they tend to change. They tend to change over time.
Okay.
Oh, you're older now, or you go to school longer, we're going to do this differently, etc. They tend to change. We're not going to spend a lot of time on those spoken rules. Those are
easy.
Yeah, they're easy, and we know them, and we may not like them, but because they change, we tend to have a choice to not carry them with us further on into life. We can say, I'm getting married, no longer we're going to do this. The kids are leaving home, we're not going to do this anymore, that kind of thing. Unspoken rules are very different because they're rules we live by, but we don't typically know we live by them because they've never been verbalized. We grow up, we take them in as assumptions. And as assumptions, we project them on the rest of the world. This is the way the world works. And they tend to revolve around things like emotions. How is anger expressed? How is affection expressed?
I guess that's not something you just talk about as a kid. Well, I guess sometimes they say like don't cry.
Yes, right, exactly. Yeah, don't cry. Yeah. And if I watch it in my parents and we don't speak about it, then I experience it as a part of adulthood. It's an aspiration that I have to do this. So Dad doesn't cry. He never said, don't you dare cry, but he never cried. And instead of crying, he gets mad. Well, okay, then I aspire to that. That's what grown-ups do because we've never talked about it. Dad never said, listen, just so you know, you're never going to see me cry, but when I'm hurt, I will be angry. So my voice will go up. They don't talk about that.
Right.
It just happens. And because they are assumptions, then we carry them with us into adulthood. We tend to not be even aware of them until we are comparing them to other families. Because I grew up, I leave the home, and this is how everybody works. In my mind, this is an assumption. Well, then I get married. And I marry someone who had a different set of unwritten rules that she or he carries with them as an adult.
So when you're getting into another relationship with someone, how do they usually come to the surface? Is that like, do they stay unspoken, or are they like a...
That's great. Depends on the relationship.
Because I feel like sometimes it would just be really difficult to talk about unspoken rules with someone you love, because you can't just be like, stop doing that. My dad never did that. Because you've never talked about it before. So you don't
But in a comfortable relationship, depending on how it's developed, it might be, that's really interesting. Tell me why you do that.
Okay.
Gosh, you do that. I've never experienced that, or something like that. Now, in a lot of relationships, we don't do that, especially in a relationship, in a family that had a lot of shame. And we'll talk about shame with rules. Got a lot of shame, then you're doing this weird thing. I have anxiety about thinking about confronting it in you, so that I'm not comfortable enough to say, why do you do that? I've never seen that before. We never did that in my family. So we can have a dialogue about it.
Yeah.
So how it ends up in relationship depends on the development of the relationship.
Yeah. Okay.
So that in marriage, so when I see couples in marital counseling and they've been married 2 years or less, 90% of what they bring to the table as initial conflict has to do with unwritten family rules. And a lot of it is about how emotions are expressed or how connection is made, because it's so weird. There's something wrong with my partner because they're always complaining, or they never complain, or they conflict so much, or they never conflict, or whatever it is. So those unwritten family rules are very powerful. And I'm thinking a lot of their power comes from the fact that I'm not aware of them. And they come up in valuable relationships, intimate relationships, and then they feel threatening, that, oh, it's a bad thing. Wow, you do that? No, we can't have that because the rest of the world does what my family did.
Okay.
And often it comes out in relationships as, what's wrong with you? That's really weird. Something's wrong with you. You do this thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it revolves around expression of strong emotions.
Right. Okay.
And so that's when we tend to become aware of it, either in marriage or in close intimate relationships that we value, because now they're threatening, where in our family they were a given. I know that I don't confront because confrontation ends badly. And so a couple episodes we talked about family roles and the family mobile.
Yeah.
And while family roles give us a place where we fit on this mobile, family rules tell us how we play out our role. And one of the reasons they're powerful is that unwritten family rules tend to be enforced by shame, by rejection.
Oh, okay, okay.
And so then, because as a child, rejection from my family, abandonment, is very threatening. If that rule is attached to my belonging here, my capability here, then it has a real emotional load. As a kid, I am invested in pleasing my parents because my life depends on them. But, this is one of those things that goes through generations. My parents, if they were raised by shame, that's their key variable in terms of how they're going to make me do what they want me to do. And it tends to be shame. And phrases like, you're acting out or doing something they don't like. How dare you do that to me? That's a threatening shame, especially if I wasn't realizing I was doing something that was outloaded. Or, don't be so stupid. Or, why can't you be like your brother? Or, why are you always like your brother? Why can't you be like Billy across the street? These are all shaming statements that are not they're not identifying my behavior, they're identifying me. So rather than saying that was a bad choice and you can make another one, what's wrong with you says there's a permanence here. There is something with you that's wrong, rather than next time, why don't we try this, so that it's attached to behavior.
Yeah.
But that's where unwritten family rules get their power.
So unwritten family rules are always enforced by shame? Is that kind of a general?
Yeah, I would say that's true. It's kind of hard for me to picture another example because we can't talk about them.
Right.
So when a parent says, "Oh, you took that snack when I said don't take it, we're going to have dinner soon," automatically it's spoken.
Yeah.
There's something like that. If what I say is, you're always doing this, what's wrong with you? What were you thinking? Those kind of things, as opposed to identifying a behavior and then pointing out a consequence or a different choice. Now it becomes a written rule.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah,
totally.
Rule. Totally.
So they're very powerful. And because they are unspoken, I tend to live with them as though they're assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
and then that's why they are very difficult to change,
Right.
because I'm not aware that I carry them with me.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, here's an example. Let's see, example of family rules. It's hypothetical. Here we got this family. We're watching them at dinner, and they don't know we're watching them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is kind of creepy to think about, but just
Sure.
as an example.
Yeah.
So we got
It's
three kids.
research.
Yeah, right. It's research. Got this devil mirror. Yeah. In the middle of dinner, 10-year-old boy gets angry. And something was said or whatever it was. And what he does is he gets up from his seat, goes into his room, closes the door. All right. All right. He just gave us some great principles of unwritten family rules and how they work,
Okay.
because he got angry and he had to leave the table. Well, leaving the table was removing him from the family. Now, assuming he wouldn't have gotten slapped across the room because he got mad, he is telling us this is not acceptable. What's going on to me is not acceptable in this family, and I will remove myself from this family.
Okay.
All right. Now, depending on when he comes back, if he ever comes back, or what happens when he comes back, then we'd say, oh, this is how this plays itself out. But we would assume that he's showing us a family rule, and he's showing us that it is reinforced by shame, because what he's demonstrating is I can't be with this family when I feel these things.
Yeah.
And so he removed himself. Now, given that, we can make some assumptions about the rest of the family members. Because if that is true, that is an unwritten rule, we would assume that those people in that family would be uncomfortable with the expression of anger in other places also. That even outside this family, if someone's getting angry, we would assume that there would be anxiety in each of these family members. And then their family role would give us an indication of how they would react to that anxiety, because they've got to manage that anxiety somehow.
Mm-hmm.
He managed the anxiety by isolating, and so he removed himself. So we would assume he would develop into an avoider, that he would learn, yeah, no bad feelings, don't do that, and so I will escape it, unless somewhere along the line he makes a conscious choice that I'm not going to do that again. Typically, that's not going to happen in a 10-year-old in his family of origin, because the risk is too high.
Becoming a mediator or something, or choosing to change into a mediator.
Yeah, or something. Now, if there's already a mediator in the family, it's unlikely that he's going to duplicate a role, because roles tend not to be duplicated in a family. We would think, oh, he's probably going to continue this, especially if that isn't the breaking of another rule. So the parents don't go into his room and say, listen, here's a better way to do this, and when you did this, so that it becomes a spoken rule, But we tend to carry it with us into adulthood, and that's where it plays itself in marriage. And that's what I say, when they come into counseling and they've been married for 2 years, you can about take it to the bank that there are irritations that have come up now that didn't come up in courtship. If they came up in courtship, they may not have gotten married. It may have dissolved the relationship, but here we are. And so that tends to be true. And because we can look at this family, we can say, oh, the effects of unwritten rules are fairly predictable if they can be identified.
Okay.
Because those assumptions, we carry them with into adulthood, and then we describe them as personality. Why do you do that? Well, it's who I am. It's my personality.
Oh, wow.
Which gives this air of permanence to it.
Yeah.
Is that, well, this is the way I do it. I'm an avoider, or I'm a confronter, or whatever.
Yeah.
And rather than addressing it as, well, it's something I do, and I can choose to change it or not. But when I identify it as my personality, it's who I am, then there's this sense of, well, I'm stuck with it, and in relationship, you're stuck with it in me. Or we have to end the relationship, or something terrible is happening.
Yeah.
Rather than it's a habit that I haven't learned to call a habit.
Right.
I say, this is who I am.
You think everything we do is a habit? None of it, like because we identify so much of ourselves as a personality trait.
Yeah.
I am, I don't know, conflict avoidant, or I am XYZ. And those are clearly, I assume those are clearly shaped by family habits, family patterns, family things, like wherever you grow up, whether it's a family or anywhere,
right,
there are habits that form in you that become personality. but we identify them completely as personality traits.
Yeah, see, that's a great question. It's big.
Yeah.
What do we do with brain trauma? Someone's in a car accident and their personality changes, and now they are like this. Well, then we'd have to say, well, that's not a habit. Maybe it is a habit, and it's just now it's different. But
got knocked into them from another past life,
right, or something. Yeah, or there is neurology, but often that neurology isn't as easily identifiable. So maybe that's true. So we have someone, with bipolar disorder, which we are looking at these days as neurological, or
so something like bipolar, this might be going too much of a tangent, but something like bipolar, that is not a coping mechanism that a child learned. That is a neurological disorder,
well,
that we know of right now.
Yes, for now we'll say that, because I'm thinking, okay, how accurate and how reliable is a diagnosis of bipolar, as opposed to a borderline disorder or narcissistic disorder or whatever? And so diagnosis, this is another rabbit trail. We'll do some other time. Diagnosis is just looking at a set of symptoms, trying to give it a name so that we as clinicians or the insurance company or whatever have something we can identify. But every diagnosis is on a spectrum. And so is it mild? Is it severe? And how mild is it before you don't call it the thing? And you go to the DSM-5 and say, well, they need 5 symptoms out of 9. They only got 4. They don't get a diagnosis.
Yeah, formulas only go so far.
They only go so far.
Right.
But for the sake of our conversations, let's say 90% of what we call our personality can fall into this category of habit.
Right.
It's because it's not who I am. It's who I learned I must be for this family to remain stable.
So here's, again, this might be going off the trail, but when I think about like formation of humans and then coming into adulthood and experiencing different anxieties around different interactions with people, the anxiety gives me information on something being out of balance in my interaction. Usually for me, in my like adult journey, I've named it as I am most likely being dishonest somehow in this moment, because once I'm overtly honest with whoever I'm interacting with by just saying something like, I'm really uncomfortable, or I don't know what's going on here, like I don't know where I stand with you, and like just being honest with something that I haven't spoken yet, the anxiety, nothing changes externally really, but the anxiety dissipates. So my anxiety, you can't over generalize everything, but I usually identify my personal anxiety as my personal dishonesty within any given moment. And sometimes situations are unsafe, to be completely honest, and so you just don't be honest and then go home and deal with it.
Key variable. That's a key variable in what you're saying, because I'm thinking up to that moment, then you were describing yourself as a system, the way we're talking about a family system. And there's this disequilibrium in me. Something isn't right. Well, you have learned to identify dishonesty and openness as creating that dissonance in you. And so you'd say, oh, that's your system, and it probably has changed since you were 10 years old.
Absolutely.
This is learned. You have learned this thing. And so when you changed, when you were saying, the anxiety goes away, unless this relationship isn't safe, important feature, because you read that lack of safety through your own filter. And you might be mistaken. This person might be safe, but they don't feel safe. They don't look safe. And so I avoid it. Now I have this dissonance I have to do something with. I'm not being honest. And that's where in a meaningful relationship that progresses through stages and develops, then you may find one day that I think I can trust this person with this information. And you experiment and find out, oh gosh, it's safe. Well, now that system can find equilibrium in the midst of this dyad, or, oh, they're safe. I'm willing to risk it. You might then also find out, oh my gosh, this person's not safe. I saw this other person say that and there was this explosion. And then we say, well, my judgment was good, though it required dishonesty on my part. So I have to resolve that dissonance within me. It's not going to be resolved in this relationship. every question is more complex than the question,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
Yeah.
the picture's bigger than that, and there's these variables to it.
Yeah.
But so when we're talking, you and I, about family rules, in every turn, there is this kind of thing. It's never as simple as just A or B. It always are these factors. And that's why I love you are really good at bringing up those factors when we talk. Because the principles, which I think are very helpful as tools, they still only apply in X percentage of the time. Kind of like that, a neurological disorder. What do you do with Down syndrome? Is that habits?
Yeah.
No, that's neurological.
Right.
There's genetic, those kind of things.
Yeah.
So it's always more complex than that.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking for our discussion and for our audience, and we just start with the idea that there are things about me that I've never paid enough attention to know, and then I just view them or treat them as though they're inevitable and they are not manageable. And in the cases we're talking about, the good news about unwritten family rules is when you become aware of it, it is not helpless, but you may feel helpless, especially if it comes up first in your marriage. My husband doesn't like me, wife doesn't like me because I'm like this. Well, okay. If we grew up with shame, then we generalize like that.
Yeah.
If we didn't, we might be able to say, do I want to change that? Okay, my wife would like this. Am I willing to change that? Well, just that type of thinking says I'm not viewing it as permanent. I'm making a choice, and that choice is going to be based on the impact on this relationship.
Right.
For most of us, somewhere along the line, to get to that place takes labor. And it usually comes as the outcome of some kind of crisis or some kind of very difficult situation that I have to self-examine. Why do I do that? Or I regret doing this. What do I do now?
Yeah.
And as relationships progress, well, that may mean an apology. That may mean some kind of acknowledgement, or requires, like you're saying, honesty. I'm uncomfortable with this, or this hurts me, or I feel bad about this, or something like that, where it becomes a written rule, and then in a relationship we decide on rules, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But in the family you grew up in, that tends not to be true. Another example, young married couple, we'll call them John and Jane. They come into my office and they have this pattern of conflict, and they're adversaries in it. And Jane says, gosh, John has an anger management problem. He's loud, he's, aggressive, he's always confronting things, etc. And John says, I don't know what to do with my wife. I never know what's going on with her. She's unpredictable. She doesn't share with me, etc. And so we take a few sessions going into their families of origin. And sometimes that's hard for people to understand. Why don't we, come on, tell us what to do here. Right? Well, go to church, listen to a whole bunch of sermons, and you'll get that. Go read a self-help book, you can get that. But this, we're going to try not to make this generic. We're going to try to look at this as what's this marriage, this new system you formed. And so we take a little jaunt into their histories. We find out that Jane, she grew up in a family where very high priority, though unspoken, is when you love someone, you protect them from painful feelings. That's how you love. No one ever told her that. It just worked this way every day of her life. And if you don't care about someone, or if you hate someone, well, you tell them whatever you feel like. You just blast them, and so she knows this in the core of her being. This is how the world works. And so you may be hurt or you may be angry, but you process that inside. You don't give it to the other person because you love them. So you don't want them to feel bad. John came from a different family, and he knows this in the core of his being. When someone is important to you, you resolve things as fast as you can, as soon as, meaning you confront it now, and you stay with it until it's at peace, because you love them. People you don't care about, you don't do anything with.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
Don't talk about it.
Yeah, they don't affect me. I can detach from it. Well, we look at that and we say, well, who's right and who's wrong? What's the rule here? And my inclination is to say, well, it's not about right or wrong.
Yeah.
It's about a system that is now blending into this third family system from these other two family systems, and it's not functioning well. And so you get to sculpt your new relationship, but not until you become aware of the differences and treat them as differences, not shame.
Mm-hmm.
So when John says about Jane, she can't think, she is so unpredictable. She's just crazy. Well, that's shame. That's
Well, and
not going to
shame,
lead to it.
if we're identifying shame like that, is shame usually tied to the identity?
Yes.
Because that's not saying like what you did was crappy. Like what
Right.
you did made me feel good. It's saying you
Very
made
different.
me feel bad.
There's
So
something
that's
wrong
like
with you.
identifying someone shaming you or you shaming someone is because you're wrapping up their actions into them. Like I'm dating
Absolutely.
someone and you say, I maybe I don't like them anymore because they are this.
Yeah.
Rather than being like they've done something that I don't like.
Right.
And maybe that's a thing that we can work on. I don't know, just like the idea of shaming someone or
Right.
being shamed feels like it's always tied to an identity rather than something practical like
Absolutely.
an action.
I tell you what, here's a rabbit trail.
Okay.
And I don't know, we may have done this in an earlier episode,
Okay.
but so we've got these two terms, shame and guilt.
Uh-huh.
And in our culture, we tend to use them interchangeably.
Right.
All right. And they're not interchangeable. They're two very different things.
Yeah.
So guilt is associated with something I did.
Mm-hmm. I am guilty.
I am guilty. Guilt, until 150 years ago, guilt was never identified as something I feel. It's something I am. That's why I go to jail. That's where there's a trial. That's why I'm getting punished, because I'm guilty. Doesn't matter how I feel. Biblically, it's interesting too. Genesis to Revelation, I cannot find anywhere that guilt has an emotional component to it. It's the outcome of a behavior. I violated my values, I broke the law, whatever. Shame is a feeling. Now, the good thing about guilt has a direction.
Mm-hmm.
There's always something I can do about guilt. I can confess, I can repent, I can pay restitution, I can do something to relieve that guilt. Now, shame is a feeling, and it's a bad feeling. We do wild things to get rid of shame. Absolutely. Yeah. You can make a very good argument, in fact, that any addiction is shame-based.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Alcoholics don't drink because they're thirsty. They drink because they're escaping something. I know we talked about that.
Oh, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
That's probably back in our addiction when we talk about that. We talk about guilt and shame. But when shame and guilt are connected, that's a good thing. We call that conviction, because guilt gives us a direction, shame gives us a motivation. And so when I feel bad because I've done something, then I have a direction I can choose or not, but I have a direction.
Mm-hmm.
But when I experience shame and it's not associated with guilt, a correctable behavior, that's where it gets toxic. And so if I grew up in a family where I was told, when you do that, mommy doesn't love you, let's say, well, that's shaming and it's frightening. It has to do with abandonment and rejection. And I will obey next time, unless I'm that family mascot and know that if I obey next time, mom and dad are going to have a blow up and I better, that kind of thing. But otherwise, that's shaming. And what I do is I attach it to myself, that there's something wrong with me, and it becomes my personality rather than, here's a direction, here's a plan. Now, when we grew up in a family culture that reinforced that, I entered adulthood with this feeling of shame when something familiar happens, even though it may have very little to do with me. It's not something with me as a source. And so that's what I'm thinking with John and Jane. When John gets angry and raises his voice, she experiences shame because this communicates to her that she's unloved. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not a correct conclusion, but it is absolutely what she feels.
Right.
And she then associates that with my husband is bad behavior or my husband doesn't love me.
Right.
That kind of thing. And that's where it gets complex. When we aren't able to sort that out, we just react to each other. And certainly, unfortunately, for lots of couples, those never get identified. They never get resolved. they just then create this,
Oh, yeah.
like we were talking about, disequilibrium in the family system. Wait a minute, there's this ongoing chaos because we've never identified this as something we brought from the last generation. Once we do that, we can choose to change it. But it goes through what you just described within yourself is, I'm not being honest if I don't say, here's what's going on inside of me. And then hopefully the other person can say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. I appreciate you telling me that. What should we do? Or here's what's going on inside of me. Or those kind of things where we begin negotiating it, because those unwritten rules become written.
Yeah.
They become spoken. And now we can begin negotiating them, changing them.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a dynamic that I'm wondering about that, hopefully it'll be quick, but like the idea of, so I'm thinking about myself in like past relationships, having assumptions and saying like, well, this is how one functions, and I don't feel loved by this person because he's functioning a different way.
Yeah.
And then going to one of my girlfriends to talk things out and say, he did this and isn't that terrible? It told me that he doesn't love me.
Right.
And having a girlfriend who probably comes from a similar family system as me, confirming my belief, and not being able to have the capacity to say, that's deep-seated family rule in you. But me too. But hey, this is what's happening, and no, I think he loves you, but he's communicating a way that he learned when he was a kid, and you're reading, it's like the 5 love languages, whatever. But having friends that confirm your unwritten beliefs feels like something that happens super often. And whether it's because they have the same unwritten family rules or because we're just people pleasers and we confirm with each other, especially on women's parts, like we don't like conflict, and so we just tell our girlfriends like,
there, honey.
Yeah. Of course, what you're feeling is correct. Instead of like, no, what you're feeling is true. Like you can't you honor your feelings.
Can't not feel it.
But the capital T truth is that something else is at play here, and you're translating it through the only lens you have. So let's look at it with a broader lens. But
beautiful example.
Having I don't know, having friends that confirm those things feels dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. And I would put 2 categories, and this might be just me projecting a bias, but you describe 2 friends. One who will say, well, let's think about this. Could it be this? Or gosh, that's I would say, ooh, that's a valuable friend and maybe very rare. But it's a valuable friend. She is definitely saying, I'm more interested in your development than I am in your comfort. She's not saying it that coarsely, but she's saying, yeah, honey, I get it. And if she can say that empathically, wow, there's a skilled friend. The other friend, it doesn't make them a bad friend, but it is an unskilled friend who is just reacting with their own stuff. But that friend, hopefully you can grow together and then begin changing that. What I really need from you is, when I come and I'm going to blast my husband, once you've let me blast, can you confront me?
Help me see the other side.
Help me think. Yeah. I'm not thinking straight there. And then hopefully she can say, well, I'll work on it. It may take me a few years. Is this one of those times where you want me to confront you? That kind of thing.
You want to pat you on the back or
exactly. And then I'd say, oh, that's a valuable friend too, but she's in a different level of process. This one over here.
Yeah.
Now, you might find that she never does that. Well, then we'd say, okay, well, so this is what I would call an acquaintance. Fun, we do XYZ, but I have a boundary here. I don't
That's
trust
what we
her.
call boat friends.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
there you go.
We have boat friends, we have intimate friends, but these are boat friends.
Right, exactly.
Just hang out on the boat with them.
Yeah, you hang on the boat, and they're fun and they're nice. They're not broken, terrible, neurotic people.
No, you just
but they don't invest in me that way. And I need some people in my life that invest in me that way. It's unrealistic to think everybody's going to be at that level.
You got to have realistic expectations for each relationship.
Exactly, right. And then when I read those expectations, I can put you in this other category of, okay, well, we can do that, but you're not someone that I dump on because you're going to make me even more
progress
mad.
there. Yeah.
There's no progress. It's not forward momentum.
Yeah.
But to do that, this person has to care more about your development than your comfort. And for most of us, we want people to be comfortable in our presence because then they like us and they, etc. And this person over here, she got there through effort. She has been through some, that is more than likely learned, unless she came from a remarkable family, that were, wow, that's pretty cool if the parents were able to impart that. And those families exist. They don't come to my office. I never meet those folks, So I'm thinking, oh, how rare is that? I don't have a real good measurement, but I think of it as something that's been learned in adulthood that and those can become soulmates,
Yeah, for sure.
So did that address what you're saying?
Yes.
Great stuff. Yeah. So unwritten family rules revolve around typically the expression of emotions, and the emotions typically would be, and I'm saying typically because it's not universal, but typically would be emotions that we identify as negative: anger, sadness, grief, fear, anxiety, those kind of things that when I express them to someone who cares, they feel similarly and they don't want that feeling, I grew up in a world then where what was conveyed to me was my parents' anxiety about my anxiety. And so they had their reactions: anger, withdrawal, avoidance, all of which communicated rejection to me. Very probably not not purposeful. But I have this feeling, and so then these become embedded in me. That, oh gosh, when I feel anxious, shut up, because I'm going to feel worse in a couple of minutes. And so that's where we see the patterns going through generations. Now, looking at those strong emotions and the fact that that unwritten rule was reinforced, it had a purpose, tells us they don't change quickly or easily. They change because usually one of three things happens. Either there is some kind of trauma where I have to face this unwritten rule that I never thought about, whatever that looked like, or a crisis that it reached a point where it created way more difficulty than it calmed down. One of those two things. Or I've become aware of it and I'm going to make conscious labor of changing this thing. And a lot of times that's a result of crisis or trauma also. But it doesn't have to be. I may have read a book and said, oh my gosh, this is me. I can see this. I am not going to do this anymore. And I start working on it. And then we'd say, well, yeah, that's not really the result of crisis or trauma. But all three of those tend to be where unspoken family rules, what we call, we have this term in my field that we throw around that is confusing to all of us: unconscious. Unconscious. You shrug because we do that all the time. We don't know that it exists. We can't measure it. It's not a it's not a thing. But we look at behaviors and awareness, and we have this term to describe when those disconnect. And so I can see it in you. You do this all the time, and you say, I don't do that. Okay, well, so we describe that as unconscious or subconscious. So it's a nice category to use. But
I use that all the time.
Everybody does. But when it's unconscious, then again, it gives this air of permanence to it. That, what do you do if it's unconscious? Well, get someone to yell at you regularly. 30, 40 years ago, they talked about having a rubber band around your wrist. And when you use something, just whack, so that you're associating a negative with a positive. The trouble is, I'm doing it decisively, so I don't feel helpless when I do this. I'm doing something strategic. If it works, fine. It's not particularly, damaging, but I don't know many folks that went through that who came out remarkably changed. Because you can decide, I don't want to do that this time. It's okay. That's because you're in control, and there's a good feeling of being in control. So go for the rubber band if you want to, but you can call it unconscious. But when I talk about it unconscious, now I can become aware of it. You have pointed out to me, and if I can manage my defenses and say, that's interesting, I'm not aware of that, tell me more. Now I'm one of those friends that are, okay, I want my development more than my comfort, and we can talk about it. And then I can take this away because you're not my enemy. You've given me data and I trust you, and now I can begin working on it, which that's that third way that really is preferable than crisis or trauma. But more often than not, it's change is forced upon me rather than something I've chosen on something that, like an unwritten rule that I have not been aware of. What makes it difficult is I tend to project onto you the violation of my unwritten rule. And that's why I say, what's wrong with you? Why do you do it that way? And so for John and Jane, they have these unwritten rules and they're projecting them onto each other. Now, in the course of therapy, where we're heading, because now we've gone through the family of origin, and we can look at Jane and say, oh gosh, this has always been true in your life. Oh, John, this is always true in your life. Now, what are we going to do to change it? Well, we're going to talk about it. Lots, have conversations. John, when you're about to raise your voice, start talking to Jane about what we just talked about here. Oh, you know what? I am feeling abandoned. I am feeling betrayed. I'm feeling as though I'm not loved, as opposed to saying, don't ever do that again, etc.
Again, it comes back to like the only thing you have control over is what's going on inside of you. So if you have the impulse to point at someone else and say you're doing something,
yes,
just try to like say, why am I about to say that? What do I feel right now? And instead saying like, I feel this.
It takes a lot.
It takes a lot.
Right on the money. That is how we change unwritten family rules. It's how we alter our family roles. It's about how we juggle our family identity. All these pieces, the road leads there. Starts with pay attention to me. What do I know about me? I keep hitting the microphone now. What do I know about me? And what does it say about me? So to get to that first point of me, that's a major hurdle for most of us. That, okay, what does this say about me? And how typical is this of me? How often do I do this? And then what is it? What label would I give this feeling? And then can I give that label to this person? I'm scared. I'm afraid you're going to leave me. I'm afraid you don't like me. Can I give that to you? Big risk. Higher the shame, bigger the risk. And so to do that, and hopefully that you then don't reinforce the shame, you then can express curiosity. Okay, help me understand. I need to know that, etc. Now we're heading down that path that can eventually lead to, okay, how can we do this differently? What can I do this different? Okay, and what can I do different? Okay, let's try this. I think I would feel differently if you did this. What can I do differently that you would feel different? And we experiment. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And if we don't work, we go to plan B, we do it all over again. Because I'm unraveling something that I have experienced all my life. And it doesn't fit anymore. Because with unwritten rules, they did fit. You're not crazy. You learned this and you learned it to survive. So our lives and relationships are full of this kind of stuff. And identifying it as an issue is where we start. Often, part of that equilibrium we talked about last time about the family of origin, there's a loyalty that we may not identify that way, but it's a loyalty to that family system. And unwritten rules kind of designate that loyalty. So when I begin breaking those rules, there is this sense, we can call it shame or we can call it dissonance. There's this feeling inside that I shouldn't be doing this.
Like you're betraying something.
Exactly. And remember, unwritten rules are, they're reinforced by rejection. Like the little boy at the table. He already knew, if I'm going to be mad, I got to be alone. I got to get out of here. I will do it for the family. Doesn't have to reinforce this. I'll enforce it myself. I will go away, relieve you from my presence because I'm about to do something terrible, that kind of thing. Well, then making those changes means disrupting that sense of loyalty that I've always had. And it's not that parents do this on purpose.
No, nobody.
It's not like there's a
nobody
villain.
does. It's unconscious.
It's unconscious, right? There we go. Didn't that work well?
Yeah.
So mom and dad, they were unconscious because they learned it themselves, and somewhere along the line it worked for them, and they didn't make the changes. Here's a bit of trivia. Now, I'm stepping on a limb here because I may have my data not quite correct, but it's just, if it's not true, it ought to be. All right?
Okay.
I was born in 1954. All right? 1954, from everything I have seen, was the year the first parenting book was published for the general population.
Okay.
Right? Dr. Benjamin Spock, Infant and Child Care.
Spock,
that was the name of the book. Right? Now, that book was powerful. It was on everybody's shelf. All my friends, you could find it. My
know
folks
about
had
it.
Absolutely, And we look at it now and say, oh man, it was off on a lot of things. No, that's not a great idea. But it was the pioneer. And so Benjamin Spock was the first one to say, you can change this, you can do this differently. Up until that point, the only frame of reference we had, which certainly was my parents, the only frame of reference they had was their own parents. That,
Yeah.
oh, this is the way you parent, this is the way I grew up,
Mm-hmm.
which is really sad, that, man, it just carries generational impacts.
Yeah.
So Spock broke the door open. Now, here's a place where I won't take this to the bank,
Okay.
but the next book, at least that was widely circulated, very popular in parenting, was published in 1972. It's the year I graduated from high school.
Well,
All
okay.
right. And that was Jim Dobson's book, Dare to Discipline.
Okay.
Now, there may have been other books that were published in the meantime, but they didn't hit the market the way Dare to Discipline. It was just a groundbreaker. Well, that means from the time I was born to the time I graduated, Benjamin Spock was as close to parenting as my parents could get. And my parents, they didn't speak the language. They immigrated from Sweden, so they were learning the language when they got this book. And I'm thinking, wow, I don't know how much they integrated or not, But that's why I'm thinking, man, that generation is worthy of lots of grace, of just, wow, what did they have, for heaven's sake? They had wherever they came from.
Yeah.
And maybe they're kibbutzing with the neighbors or something. It was, now
they're go depending on their own recognition of patterns.
Right, which is loaded with their own unwritten family rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we go to a bookstore and my gosh, there's a wall of parenting stuff.
Yeah.
And some of it is nonsense.
Terrible.
Some of it is absolutely toxic, but a lot of it is very reasonable, good stuff. And so that's why I'm thinking, okay, I think one of my mantras when you guys were little, especially for our firstborn, Carlin, gotta forgive me in advance. Everything with you is an experiment. Never done this before, honey. So I'll do the best I can, But it was that acknowledgement of, man, there is there's limited exposure. I certainly had more because I went through graduate school and all that stuff. But it's still, there's so much variance to personality and birth order and family systems. And so it's a very complex thing. And so when we as adults are going to change what we grew up with, the easy thing to do is to project it as anger or resentment towards our parents, some of which very likely is merited, But most parents, at least that I become aware of, I wouldn't call them evil. I believe there is evil in this world, but I seldom encounter generational stuff that I could put in the category of, well, that's just raw evil. It really is ignorance and attempts to do something that's not successful, and unfortunately then the resistance to changing this system that's not successful.
Okay, so
but we can.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for taking steps to start recognizing unspoken familial rules?
Yeah, right.
Unspoken family rules. How does one begin identifying those things in their life?
That's great. Yeah, that's great. Well, so quick little advertisement here, though it's pretty futile. I wrote a book on this back in the early 90s, all right?
Yeah.
Your Family Voyage. And I had a chapter, except that was so long ago, I'm not sure I can remember everything I wrote.
Okay.
Maybe we'll do it in another episode. But unwritten family rules. If once you have this concept that you and I are talking about, now you get together at a family dinner or a family reunion, watch the behavior. Try to watch it beyond your own anxiety, beyond your own reaction to it. What's going on here that doesn't go on in the rest of the world?
Okay.
And that will begin to identifying these rules. And they're not necessarily toxic, but just to begin to develop an awareness. If you're married or you have a very close relationship, ask to be confronted. When I do weird things, let's talk about it, because that's how I need to become aware of, oh, that's not the way it worked in your family. And when you say that wasn't the way my family worked, avoid the temptation to say, well, it's because your family is crazy. Well, we know about your family. They don't work well. Well, let's get away from that to, okay, what is this awareness in me? Another way is when you're with your family, siblings, parents, whatever, and you can identify, this is anxiety. Something just happened that my stomach got tight. What just happened? And what does that say about an unwritten rule that I might not be identifying, but I have this reaction. It's emotional. Don't run away from it. Don't placate it. Examine it.
Okay.
This is anxiety. Where is the danger? Something just happened that I experienced as dangerous. No one's after me. I'm not about to be hit, but I have this, and this is old. Okay. This anxiety doesn't belong here.
Yeah.
That's one way. Kibutzing with others, good friends, where it's just almost recreational conversation. Let me tell you about my family. You tell me about your family. We're not in judgment, but just exploring. That is so wild. Oh, wow, I never knew that, or I didn't see that, or for myself as a family, I grew up in a family that were teetotalers. We never had alcohol in home. Some of my dearest friends and most helpful friends grew up in alcoholic homes that were full of chaos. Those are great conversations because my family certainly had chaos in it, but it wasn't like that.
Right.
And so it's not about one being better or worse. It's about how have I developed? What is in me that came from these, what we're calling unwritten, unspoken family rules that we never talked about. I assumed everybody was like that. And then when I encounter something that's different, it's like an epiphany, as long as I can accept it. I don't have to shut it down, don't have to push it away. Wow, what was it in my family that made me so blind to what you're saying? Because it would never occur to me, that kind of thing. That's how we start. Biggest hurdle is usually managing our own defenses. That the unspoken loyalty to my family. No, my family is not bad, so we're not talking about that. It has to be your family that's bad. Oh, that's an important factor, because that says if I entertain this idea, I will no longer belong in my family. And as a kid, that's terrifying.
Yeah,
as an adult, may not be so bad.
That might be the goal.
Might be an upside to it. Yeah, right. Yeah. So, but so that's how we begin that path of looking at it, and that's by when having close, vulnerable relationships becomes, I want to say, essential in lots of ways, but at least really handy.
That's so hard. That might be an episode on its own, how to make adult friends. Because I am very lucky, and I live in but I know I have a unique existence. Not everybody my age has friends. Not everybody as adults have friends. Like we were talking about earlier, not on the air.
Yeah.
There are so many middle-aged people that just can't even identify having one close friend.
I know.
So that in itself is a challenge.
Well, and now add to that the male population that is identified as being friendless. You don't take risks. Most men grew up in a world where that's not what you do. That's weird. And in the early 80s, there was a book that came out called The Friendless American Male. Pretty radical in its day, but it talked about the need we as men, and certainly in midlife, need essential, trusting, vulnerable relationships, almost non-existent. And then we went through a movement, I think, in our culture that was associated with a Promise Keepers movement, as in the early 90s, and it was fostering that very thing. Big seminars, lots of books that were fostering relationships, healthy, vulnerable, emotionally connected relationships between men. And while that's gone into history, I can see its residue. And certainly like you're saying, I am very blessed. I have a cadre of dear friends that we get together regularly, have for some of these guys that we get together with for 40 years. We raised our kids together, and we've been through trauma together, and so that is very blessed, and I'm also aware that it's very rare. But it was developed consciously. We developed this system, this series of friends, purposefully. It wasn't that it was natural for any one of us.
Accidentally happen.
Yeah, it didn't accidentally happen. No, we decided, we need each other. No, I need some kind of sanity in the midst of my insanity, and you need the same. And so we're going to do this. But I think that's rare. But I think that is where we, at least potentially, become most aware of those blind spots we have because we trust this person to be honest, even if I don't like what he's saying. It bugs me.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like that's like there, and maybe this is a bit too generalized to say, but it seems like this is a reason that a lot of people go to therapy, is that because essentially what the friendships we're talking about are as an outside perspective of you.
Right.
And that's essentially what therapy is as well. Like you need to be humble enough to ask for someone else to hold up a mirror to you and give you a perspective of yourself that you cannot see on your own.
Right.
And, you know, help walking through whatever ensues after that. That's what those friendships are that we're talking about. And then we have professionals that do the same thing, but on a much deeper level.
Yes, and also on a safer level, because we have this ethical standard. Yeah. And so ethical standard of confidentiality. And so, you know, if you're not going to kill somebody, kill yourself, or abuse a child, this is safe here. I won't talk. Now, another ethical standard of the APA is no dual relationships. That means you like me, I like you, we have good sense of humor, etc. We will never get together for coffee at Starbucks.
Right.
I'm your therapist.
Yeah.
That is a huge violation of, you know, confidentiality. It also then will take away one of the values we have here, and that you can feel very safe and you can act badly in this room and it's perfectly safe.
Yeah.
You know, I usually say, yeah, the walls, these are reinforced walls. We have this little thing on the door. It's very quiet. Don't break my stuff. You know, don't break my stuff in here. But other than that, pretty much say what you want, you know, get escalated. That's fine. We'll work through it.
Yeah.
But take it outside that office. And now you've got this level of risk that's not inherent in that therapeutic relationship. And that safety is extremely important in that therapeutic process.
Seems like it.
So yeah, that is why lots of people go to therapy.
Yeah.
For lots of people, it's why they stay in therapy. You know, that, oh no, I don't.
I need a safe space.
Yeah, but the goal, at least in my book, my bias would be, the goal is to take what you have here and find ways to generate it out there to build relationships. But here, you got a pretty good idea coming in that it's here. Out there, you got to risk rejection.
Yeah.
And I want to say, in the long run, it's worth it, because you will be rejected and there will be abandonment, but there are people out there that are safe.
High risk, high reward.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And you just haven't identified them yet, but there are people in your life that are worth it. And so, yeah, that's a great question. We could spend lots of time on it, but that's where we start, is relationship.
Yeah.
Risk, trust,
asking
empathy.
Yeah. So then, okay, so just to wrap things up with unspoken family rules, is there anything else that people should know about unspoken family rules? Is there anything that, just for baseline introduction to the idea of unspoken assumptions and family rules, is there anything else we want to cover?
I don't know. I think we've covered, I suppose we could talk forever on it. I think the key variables are beware of shame, know what it is, and know that in those unspoken family rules, as I become aware of them, shame is integral to it. It's how and why they were unspoken. And so that when I can carry this emotion that I call shame and separate it from what's going on in my environment, that's a huge step in all kinds of things. So that would be a big one. And find trusted people. If you have siblings that you trust, and you can build that kind of relationship with a sibling, whoa, they came from the same system. They will have insights just from your conversation with each other. So if you can, and a lot of families just never generated that kind of relationship. But if they did, that's a place to start. Otherwise, find valuable people, experiment with risk. Know that even if they aren't safe, it doesn't mean they're wastrels. Like you say, they can be boat friends. Yeah. I'm not going to go there. Yeah. But I find someone else who can. Yeah. But I think we already said that.
Yeah.
But it's worth restating. Yeah. We could do this all day. Yeah. I could just restate it. But I think, and you can probably do some reading, find unwritten family rules. And there's other terms they use for it, but family systems.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. That's probably it. All right.
Cool.
Good place to stop.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to pause.
We'll probably overlap in future episodes.
Absolutely. Well, I think this overlaps into most psychological.
Right.
Things.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, that's good.
Okay.
Cool. Great.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
We had fun. I hope you did too.
Yeah.